Hello, I'm Jeff Heimbach, co-author of It's Kind of a Cute Story by Rolly Crump. For Volume 3 of More Cute Stories, we decided to talk about what is considered one of the greatest theme park attractions that never was, the Museum of the Weird. The museum was going to be part of the Haunted Mansion, a big expansion that was coming to Disneyland in the 1960s. The idea for the mansion went way back to before the park was even built, when Harper Goff drew a black and white sketch of a crooked road leading off of Main Street, USA, to a creepy old house sitting on a hill. The idea came up again when they decided to add New Orleans Square to Disneyland in the 1960s, and they included it in the massive expansion. Though the attraction itself was announced to the public in 1961, with an opening date of 1963, it would still take many years for it to come to light. After completing work on some of the projects for the 1964-65 World's Fair, Rolly was assigned to work on the Haunted Mansion project again. However, he grew tired of the typical haunted house scares that were being designed for the attraction and decided to go off in a different direction. Most of his fellow Imagineers thought his work was too out there for Walt. However, after a long sleepless night after having the ideas presented to him, Walt came up with the idea of having all this stuff in the Museum of the Weird, which would have supplemented the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. Unfortunately, after Walt passed, the idea was pushed to the side. Of course, like all good ideas, the Museum of the Weird never died. Instead, it stayed in the hearts and minds of curious Disney fans everywhere, who were always left wondering what could have been. In fact, it was the Museum of the Weird that led him to become a fan of Rolly's at a very young age to begin with. With the recent interest in the project again, with talk of a movie and a comic book series coming out in 2014, Rolly thought now would be a good time to talk about his ideas and how he and Walt envisioned it to begin with. And who better to tell the story than the man who came up with the crazy ideas himself? So sit back, relax, and enjoy More Cute Stories Volume 3, Museum of the Weird.
I'd like to tell you how the Museum of the Weird came about. It really was interesting because it was an outgrowth of what Yale, Gracie, and I were doing for 2 solid years. Walt had asked both Yale and I to work together as a team to come up with ideas and different illusions that might be in the Haunted Mansion. So we worked on that for 2 solid years, which was really kind of an interesting time frame because we were just like a couple of kids in a great big room in the animation building and reading stories about ghosts and everything and developing everything that we thought maybe would be interesting to have in the mansion. And so the first thing we did was Yale was absolutely incredible with his ideas. He was like a little tinker toy man. And I remember one day coming back from lunch and Yale had gotten a hold of a loop projector of Hans Conray's face, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, Who's the Fairest One of All, that was one from one of the TV shows. And he was projecting that face on a little bust of Beethoven. And it was really amazing because when you project a projection of something like that talking onto a 3-dimensional sculpture, it looks like the sculpture is actually talking to you. And it was absolutely amazing. And we showed it to Walt, and Walt absolutely loved it. But the one thing that bothered us, that was because the projection of the face was much larger than the little Beethoven head, Yale and I started looking around, and we found a head that they had sculpted for Fred MacMurray for the films that he was in because he was bald, and they had to make little toupees for him. So this was a full-size head that we could project the face on, and it was much, much better. So we did. We projected that onto Fred MacMurray's face, and it looked like Fred MacMurray was Hans Conray talking. The beautiful story behind all of this is that Fred MacMurray was really kind of a cheap guy, and every time they'd make a beautiful wig for him for the films he was in, he'd take the wig home. And so one day Walt said, "Fred, I don't want you to take any more of those wigs home." And he said, "Okay, I won't take them home." But also to show you how he was a little bit cheap, there was one scene he was doing in the film. It was probably the Absent-Minded Professor, to where there was a turkey, a real turkey dinner being served. And after the film was shot for that one sequence, Fred took the turkey and took it home with him. So anyway, there was quite a few stories about him being on the cheap side. Anyway, these are what we were doing, taking these illusions to a larger scale. So eventually, Yale decided that it would be good to do a full-scale mock-up of everything that we were coming up with on one of the sound stages. So Yale, some way or another, ordered a full-size piece of glass that we could use Pepper's Ghost on, which I think was probably 12 feet, 8 by 12 feet. I think it was one of the largest pieces of glass that Libby Owens Ford had ever made. And we have it delivered, and we had it put up on the sound stage. And so Yale started developing the scene behind it that would be able to create the ghosts that we want to create. And Walt had told us to use Roger Brogy for anything because he was head of the machine shop. And Walt felt that Roger, any of the mechanics that we need, Roger would help us. Well, when we started mocking things up, we went to Roger and said, could you help us with these illusions? And he said, do you have an account number? We said, no. And he said, well, I can't help you. And he turned around and walked away. And I looked at Yale, and Yale looked at me and thought, how are we going to start making these illusions animate if we can't get Roger Brogy? Well, I remember Bob Matty. Now, Bob Matty did all the special effects for the live-action films, and he actually won the Academy Award for doing the squid in the 20,000 Leagues film that he did, and he was a sweetheart of a man to work with. So I went to Matty, and I said, can you help me? And Bob said, sure, I'll be glad to help you. And I said, well, we don't have any count numbers or anything. He said, I don't worry about that. So it was really basically getting back to there were people that worked at Disney, and we all were a family, but some of the family members were a little strange on the edges, which happened to be Roger. So anyway, we did this one illusion to where there's the ghost of the woman, the wife of the sea captain that he had murdered and blocked up behind the wall in the fireplace. And in the sequence that we presented to Walt, she appears behind the brick wall, then she raises her arms and she comes flying out of it and charges forward screaming. Well, it was one hell of a piece of illusion work to be done, and it was absolutely magnificent. And Walt loved it. He just said, that's great. So he said, did Roger build that for you? We said, no, Bob Matty did. Well, Roger got a little, pretty upset about us mentioning that. And of course, Walt looked at us and said, no, you have to use Roger. You can't use Bob Matty. And we said, oh, okay. So I didn't realize that there was a problem there because we all worked under the same roof. So I went to Matty afterwards and I said, Bob, what's the problem here? And he said, when Walt opened up Disneyland, he asked me to design all the animals that were going to be in the Jungle Cruise. And he said, the hippopotamuses and everything. And so he said, I only had two and a half weeks to develop the mechanics for all of that. And he said, well, naturally, in that short a time frame, he said, they started breaking down. And he said, I had not been given the time to really engineer them properly. Meanwhile, Roger had gone behind his back and gone to Walt and said, Matty only does stuff that lasts for 10 minutes. He said, I'll do those and they'll last. So Walt said, okay. So he turned it over, took it away from Matty and gave it to Roger. And of course, Roger had quite a bit of time to redevelop all of that. So, but it didn't bother Bob Matty. It was just politics, and he didn't pay much attention to it. So that was kind of a behind-the-scenes stories of some of the things that Yale and I had to work our way through to get something done. We would do whatever was necessary. In this particular case, Bob Matty was the answer. Anyway, we had a good time on the soundstage. We did some great stuff. We had groups of people come in, and we probably put on a good hour show of a lot of the different illusions that we had done. And so basically that was pretty much it at that particular time frame. And then the World's Fair came along, and both Yale and I were taken off the Haunted Mansion to work on the World's Fair. My first assignment on the World's Fair was to work on the Ford Pavilion. And I forget, I think Yale went over and worked on General Electric, on some of the illusions for the animatronic figures there. So anyway, I worked on the Ford Pavilion. I did the ramp show. that you took to go upstairs, and you saw the little bit of history about all the different style of cars that Ford had been building. And then eventually, Walt and I had a work session about something that Walt always felt that he wanted the public to be kind of amused when they were standing in line. So he said, Rolly, we got to come up with something here when they're standing in line to get on the car. Actually, when you're at the World's Fair at the Ford Pavilion, you actually rode in a brand new Ford convertible. That was the ride that took you through all the illusions and everything that they had there, the primeval world and all of that. So I kind of came up with the idea of kind of a little abstract instrument show, a little show of musical instruments playing music. And Walt said, well, what kind of musical instruments are they? And I said, oh, I don't know. I said, maybe we'll do automobile parts and make the orchestra out of that. Walt said, well, that sounds like a good idea. He said, why don't we do that? So I got a hold of Bob Gurr, and Bob and I sat down, and probably within 3 or 4 days, we had the catalogs out of all the different implements or parts of car parts in the catalogs. And so we decide which part would you use for making a trumpet or a saxophone or whatever it was. In fact, we used hubcaps as cymbals. And so we had a great time, Bob and I did, and built a model of it, and we showed it to Walt. Walt loved it, and so that's how the musical instrument show got into the Ford Pavilion. Now, this was during the time frame that we were working on the World's Fair, and then after the fair was over, of course, then I got involved with Small World, and that pretty much ate up all of our time. So there was at least a 2-year period after being on the mansion with the fair. So then we came back from the World's Fair, and we all kind of sat around, and there wasn't anything for us to do. And so after a while, after a week or two of just looking at magazines and stuff, I thought, well, I'm going to go back and start drawing up some of the ideas that I have that might go into the mansion. And so that's when I started drawing the Candleman and some of the other figures. I also developed the Seance room. I had come up with the concept of the Seance room for the mansion, but I hadn't drawn it up or anything, and so I drew that up, and then I started drawing up some weird figures and stuff, and of course that was a takeoff on the films that I had seen that I thought were kind of a lot of fun, and they had a lot of abstract kind of surrealistic pieces in them, and like Beauty and the Beast, Jacques Cousteau's French film, to where the big monster would come into his castle, and as he'd walk down the hallway, there were these human arms holding torches that would lead the way. So I started developing that. I did columns that were human parts that built a column. I did chandeliers that were also made out of human bones and parts. And so I was just having a real good time with this. Well, I had worked on in fact, Jack Fergus, the model builder that was a personal friend of mine that worked next door, asked me, he says, Rolly, do you mind if I make some models of what you're doing? I said, no, go ahead, Jack. And so he did that. Meanwhile, because I had taken off and started doing the mansion, Dick Irvine didn't know what to give the assignments to give to anybody else, so I think he got the idea from me to get the other guys to start working on the mansion. So Mark Davis was asked to work on it. He started developing all the stretch paintings in the elevator room, and also got the architect to start developing that. And then Claude Coates was doing some renderings. And so after about, I'd say maybe a month or two, with all of us working on the mansion, Dick Irvine went to Walt and said, well, we'd like to give you a little presentation on where we are with the mansion, because there was nothing else that they'd been assigned to do, which we did. And of course, there's that great story of Rolly presenting his work and everyone else thinking that it was too weird to show Walt, and how Walt kind of got a big kick out of it and took it home with him that night mentally and couldn't get a good night's sleep and was waiting for me the next morning when I came to work. And wanted me to go into more detail about it, but he said that he had really, because he hadn't slept at all, he had come up with the idea of the Museum of the Weird. So again, the Museum of the Weird was an outgrowth of everything we were doing for the mansion, but this is Walt's idea. Now, this is where we all realized how important Walt was after he passed, of how much of our work that he did for us. And so him coming up with the idea of the Museum of the Weird, just taking my pieces and turning them into something like that. And of course, his statement was, Rolly, he said, we'll tell everybody that Disneyland has been collecting all this weird stuff from all over the world, and we're bringing it to Disneyland. So he says, we're going to have more ghosts living at Disneyland than anywhere else in the world. So it was kind of a fun time for him. Of course, then Walt presented it to the other designers and told them that they put me in charge of designing this Museum of the Weird, which was basically his idea. And of course, if he had lived, we would have built it, and he would have been the designer on that particular show. But anyway, that's basically where it went. And then when we finished with that, then there were other assignments were given to us. Now, you have to remember that the Haunted Mansion was interrupted by the World's Fair, and then the Haunted Mansion was interrupted by the new Tomorrowland that they were building for Disneyland. In fact, one day Walt came by before I got that assignment and said, what are you working on? I said, I'm working on the Museum of the Weird. He says, oh, no. He says, there's other things that we're working on that are more important at this time frame. So he went into Dick Irvine and got Dick to assign me to work on the new Tomorrowland. So the next thing I know, of course, Dick never would have assigned me to that because it took Walt to get him to get me something to do, because there was a little bit of a problem between Dick Irvine and Rolly Crump. And I really feel a lot of it had to do with I wasn't of his time frame. I was younger, and so he was more in tune with Mark Davis and Clyde Coates and John Hench than he was with Rolly Crump, because Rolly Crump was obviously kind of a little upstart with him, and so he had a problem with me. So I was assigned to do the character shop in the new Tomorrowland, which is Mickey's Mart. I did the elevator bandstand that came up out of the ground with the orchestra playing. I did also there was a temporary bandstand to where they were going to put Space Mountain, and they'd already built the model on Space Mountain. So everything I did for the new Tomorrowland was styled after the shapes that John Hench had used in designing that piece of architecture. And then there was, let's see what else there was. There was I did the trash cans. So anyway, I was having a great time. And this is what happened as we were completing the project of the new Tomorrowland, Walt passed away. And it was really a very, very tragic time. And I was right in the middle of building a lot of those models. And I'll never forget building those models and losing Walt. And anyway, we finished it, and we had an opening for the new Tomorrowland at Disneyland one night, and we cut the ribbon for the next day opening of it, and we all kind of stood there and looked at each other and like, what do we do now? Because there had not been anything given to us by Walt to work on. And the most interesting thing about this was Walt had actually laid out 25 years of work for WED, but there was nothing that was the immediate future. I mean, one of them was going to be Epcot. Obviously, one of them was going to be Disney World, the Magic Kingdom. But right then and there, after losing Walt, so it was a very, very sad time. Anyway, the next thing I know is all the other guys get assigned. All the other art directors get assigned to work on the mansion and come up with their concepts. And it was interesting that I was not invited at all to continue with the Museum of the Weird. And that's because of good old Dick Irvine. I don't think Dick wanted me around there at all. And that's really true, because the next thing I know, he's decided to make me the supervising art director of Disneyland in maintenance, and he sent me to Disneyland. So he got me out of the building. And so I was out of the building the 2 years that they were developing the Haunted Mansion. And It was okay. I did whatever they asked me to do, and I learned so much being the art director at Disneyland. You can't believe working with all the different divisions and getting to know all of them was absolutely incredible. My training was unbelievable training. Anyway, when I came back after the mansion had opened and went on the ride and everything and saw what they had done. Of course, Yale and I had designed it to where you could walk through it, to where it was much more intimate and a lot more scary. And of course, putting the ride in there, it kind of eliminated the scariness. And Dick Irvine kept saying, well, we don't want to scare people. And I remember in a meeting with Walt one time, he says, people love to be scared. So anyway, Dick asked me, he says, well, what did you think of the mansion? Did you see it? And I said, yeah. They said, what do you think? And I said, have you got a couple of months? And I'll tell you. All right. Now came the TV show, The Wonderful World of Disney. Walt always used the TV show to help advertise and promote what he was going to put into Disneyland. And this particular show was going to cover, well, there was a lot of things that Walt was talking about on this particular show, but one of them was the Haunted Mansion. And it was quite interesting because he interviewed John Hench about one of the restaurants on Main Street. He interviewed Mark Davis about the stretch paintings, and of course he interviewed Rolly about the Museum of the Weird, and which is kind of fun. I was told by the director of that show. I didn't know how I happened to be picked. And I said, how did I get picked to be on the TV show? And he said, well, we presented 6 different people that Walt wanted to talk to on the TV show. And he said, you were one of them. He said, there was 3 of them and that he finally ended up with it. But he said, definitely it was you. He said, definitely wanted Rolly, which I felt was really sweet. So anyway, we go over to the sound stage to where they were going to film it. And the soundstage had been turned into the model shop. And it was absolutely gorgeous because the model shop that we really worked in was a big corrugated barn with no heating and no air conditioning. It was like, it was like one of the art directors said, I'm out here in the garage, meaning that's who his secretary was on the intercom trying to find him. Anyway, so we all of us, there was a whole bunch of us that worked in the model shop, and we were all invited to be part of the TV show. So a lot of the people didn't have a speaking part or anything. They were just back off and to the right and to the left actually doing work and everything. So Walt came up to me with his little hostess and everything and said, Rolly, what are you working on? And I said, I'm working on the Museum of the Weird. And he says, well, tell me about the Museum of the Weird. Well, at that particular shot, I actually pick up the little model that Jack Fergus had built of the coffin clock that I had. So I held that up while I was talking. And then there was an insert of seeing a skeleton playing the organ. And it was absolutely... it was so much fun being on the sound stage with him because he was very relaxed. He was really fun. And of course, they had a monitor, and the monitor had a script of everything he was supposed to say. Well, that didn't necessarily always work. He'd look up at it and what it had to say. Maybe he'd talk about that, and maybe he wouldn't. But anyway, during that particular show, all of a sudden, while he's talking, all of a sudden he stops and says, oh, Jesus, I said Christ. And so we all kind of cracked up because we thought that was a very funny line because that was Walt. It's always saying Christ or Jesus or whatever. So he was fun to be with, and we thoroughly enjoyed that show. We had a great time. And the interesting thing about all of this, and of course it gets back to a little bit of jealousy here and there, was the fact that he had told me and discussed it with the other designers that he wanted me definitely to be in charge of the Museum of the Weird. Well, Mark Davis always believed that Walt didn't like anything I did. And he kept coming up to me and said, Rolly, Walt never liked whatever you did. And he was talking to the museum about the Museum of the Weird. And I never turned to him and said, yeah, but then why did he ask me to be on TV with him if he didn't like what I did? And using that as an example. But again, this is something that you learn to live with, the little jealousies that ran around rampant. When I was on the TV show with Walt, we had the models Oh, well, I was coming up with the sketches for the Museum of the Word. That's when Jack Fergus said, Rolly, he said, do you mind if I do some models off of what you're doing? I said, God, no, Jack, I'd love to have you do that. Anyway, the models that he built that were on the TV show was the organ, the candleman, the clock. There was a man-eating plant. And then there was 2 or 3 little pieces here that were Jack's designs that were incredible, kind of a big spooky guy standing there, and another head with his arms and legs just coming out of the head with no body. So Jack was incredible. He was a marvelous man to work with, and he and I had actually been in a carpool together for almost 2 years, and he and I were very close. We had kind of a personal relationship that was very special. After the TV show and everything that we showed there, all those models eventually were, just thrown away, which was really kind of sad. That happened with almost everything that we did in model form was eventually thrown away. So that's sad. Okay, let's talk about the layout of the Museum of the Weird. After Walt's concept came about and he gave me the title Museum of the Weird, and I went back to my office and started thinking about, okay, how would the Museum of the Weird be laid out? Because it would be a museum. And I did come up with the idea that there'd be a large rotunda that you came into to begin with, and then there would be little hallways surrounding the rotunda. But in the center of the rotunda, I designed a gypsy wagon. And the whole idea of the gypsy wagon would be that probably every 15 or 20 minutes, the lights in the entire museum would go dim. We'd get a lot of weird sounds, whether they were screaming, I don't know, just weird stuff going on from the sound system from the whole area, and that the lights would start flashing, and then the wagon would start coming apart. Actually, there would be flames jumping out of the tops of the wagon. There would be banners that were hanging on it that would begin to flow. There was a woman's head that was up front, and her eyes would start to sparkle. The doors would open up, and you'd see inside in the wagon, and probably create a lot of special illusions that looked like they were spirits flying around in there. And actually, Yale did a beautiful job when he created the ghosts in the mansion to where they will go up a big scrim. We would probably have scrims off the wagon going to the ceiling and showing all the spirits flying up in the air there like that. So with the illusions that it was possible to do after this was kind of designed, we could have had a lot of fun with it. Now, there were corridors that went off the centerpiece, and what Yale and I had done when we developed the different vignettes would be down these corridors. And I know that there was one exhibit that Yale and I both had seen up at the World's Fair up in Seattle, and what it was in the French Pavilion, there were little mini theaters, and you could walk into a little theater. It was a loop projector in there, and it would be films about the famous painters from France. And so you could sit in there for 15 minutes and watch a show and get up and leave, or you could just stand and watch it a little bit for a while, but it would be continuous. And so I feel that probably some of the vignettes that Yale and I were developing would be in there. A good example, we'd use Pepper's Ghost. And one of the vignettes you would see would be the organ. And then all of a sudden you'd see the skeleton appear and start playing the organ. Then, of course, all kinds of special effects would be coming out of the organ while he was playing it. We also would have one room that would be of the sea captain's room, to where he actually comes back, and these were little 3-minute films that you'd see, but 3-minute pieces, to where he would all of a sudden appear in his room after he had drowned at sea. And here you'd see the old sea captain there with his big old hat and big robe on and everything, and the seaweed hanging off of him, and standing there in sopping wet. And then, of course, behind him would be the brick wall to where he had murdered his wife, and she was bricked up in the wall. And then, of course, the end of that little particular scene would be that she would come out screaming and attack him where he's standing on the floor. And then, of course, both of them disappear. And that was something that you couldn't put in the ride because the ride would go past it before you had a chance to understand what the devil it was. So all these little vignettes that we were starting to develop, the one room which was which you actually would walk into, you'd actually walk into the library, and that's where we'd have the fireplace with the human heads and the green smoke coming out of their mouths. We'd have other projection faces on some of the sculptures that would talk to some of the other sculpture in the room. We'd also have the paintings come to life and talk. So the whole room that you're standing in would come alive, and there would be a little vignette in there, a little time frame, and a story that would be told. So it actually, if you really stop and think about it, it might take you a couple of hours to go through the entire museum, plus having static exhibits in some of the areas as well. So I think, and then from there, which was kind of interesting, I think Walt had the idea that then you would go through the merchandise area so you could buy all the skulls and stuff that you wanted, and shrunken heads and all of that good stuff. So I think that was kind of the idea that we had for doing the museum. Being that I did come up with the original concept of the seance room, which in the mansion I didn't think was done very well at all. I thought it was staged poorly. I did do a rendering that would go into the museum of the seance room. And in there, of course, I had a big, I think it was a devil that was a mirror, and you could see into the mirror, and you saw all kinds of special effects inside this big mirror. It had the head in the ball, and it had a chair that stood up and talked to you. So the whole room, again, another one of these rooms that would come to life, but you weren't inside of this one because you really needed to use Pepper's Ghost and the glass in this one. And so therefore it was a glass window that you look through. Like a lot of museums that you see, that you go to, you have to stand outside and go through the glass. And then, of course, there was a lot of the other, like the Candle Man, and then I did a little guy that was kind of a strange little creature that had a tail with a bunch of bells ringing on it. These were pieces of sculpture that were sprinkled throughout the main area, the large area around the wagon. So there was just, I think it was just a matter of that you had collected weird stuff, weird sculpture and weird paintings from all over the world. So the place was really packed with all kinds of strange stuff that you could bring to life. And it was free to do whatever we wanted. And we just barely got started. And some of the other stuff that we'd come up with would have been and the other was the 6 Sins of Man. And what that was you stood in an alcove, and there was a sculpture, and you were standing at the back side of the sculpture, and it was the devil. And then there was 6 mirrors in front of him, and you could see the front of him in the mirrors because you're looking from behind him, and you see his face and everything in the 6 mirrors. Well, what happened was each mirror would represent a different sin. One was greed, and one was death, and one was, pillage, with the plagues attacked everything. And so the reflection that you saw in the mirror would start to change, but each mirror would have a different reflection of what it represented. If it said greed, you'd see the reflection in the mirror would be that of the devil holding bags of gold. If you saw the plague, you'd see rats crawling over the statue of the. So in each mirror, it was a different statue, and yet when it was sculpted, it had to stay in sync with the silhouette of the actual figure of the devil standing in front of it. And it was a very easy thing to do because once it was sculpted, all you had to do was turn on the lights behind the glass, the mirror, and bring down the lights of the devil in front. So I tried to explain that particular one to Walt, and all I was using was little pieces of wood that were painted in different values of gray, and he was having a hell of a time understanding what I was trying to tell him, so I just forgot about it. All right, there's a lot of questions that I get asked, and one of them is, why do I think that the museum has stayed popular? And I think the answer to that is it was something that was mysterious, and if you have something that's very mysterious, even murder mysteries or whatever it is, it kind of is. It's quite intriguing, and I think that because there was never a strong definition of what it was going to be, written or conceived or anything, so it left a lot to people's imagination, and I think that was the intrigue. I do feel that if Walt had lived, there's no question in my mind that he and I would have worked very closely on what it would have been, because he had a vision. I probably obviously had a vision, but in this particular case, I'd use his vision to produce this. And so I think that's one of the other things, because it was his idea. It just happened that I had some sketches that gave him the idea. So I think it would have been an absolute delight working with him on it, because for some reason, he and I kind of enjoyed each other with a lot of little things that we did, and we'd pass things back and forth. So I really enjoyed that. And his involvement would have been so important on this particular one. And again, the reason it stayed alive was because in the TV show, it kind of left a little to your imagination of what maybe it might be with some of the things that we were showing you. And so that little teaser kind of stayed in there. And then, of course, later on when the E-Ticket did a story about it, and there was quite a few of my sketches that were in the E-Ticket, I think that helped keep it alive. So it's been kind of a fun thing to see. It took on a life of its own. Okay, why do you think my personal work, as well as the work I did for Disney, why is it sort of appealing? Well, I think it's because it's timeless. I know I learned to do things that were themed, and I think when you pick a theme, it becomes timeless. I mean, I've done paintings that are takeoff on Japanese art, and of course, Japanese art will be timeless. And I think that my interpretation of the Japanese art is timeless. I think that there's some of the other work, the Day of the Dead work that I've done for myself, I absolutely love. And I think I took that to another level. I think that a lot of people didn't realize in the Day of the, I'm talking a little bit about my personal work now, people didn't really realize that the Day of the Dead, and they see all these skulls, that it was kind of a spooky time frame. But when I read about it, and I went to some lectures, I found out that it was a celebration time, and that when you celebrate something, when there's someone that has passed away, you celebrate their life. You don't go into morbid things about it. The skulls weren't meant to be that way. They're meant the celebration. So I found that there was humor in all of that as well, and I think because of that, most of the work I do is unique, and being that I was a cartoonist, I think that an awful lot of my style is humorous, and it's kind of a takeoff of a little more sophisticated cartoon. And I definitely feel that imagination is my sword, or my wand, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, I do love doing things that are a little different and a little bit weird. So that helped me when I did The Candle Man. Coming up with that concept, I don't know where the hell I got that idea. But anyway, being as weird as all of this is, it's kind of the same for me. The Museum of the Weird really has a life of its own, and I think because the imagination that comes out of it, it's like whenever I've done artwork and I take it to a certain point, then the artwork takes over and starts telling me what I should do. And I think this is true with the Museum of the Weird. I do know that a while back, the concept of a chess game with all the characters that are that would be in the chess game would be pieces. The pawns would be the little guy that's on the floor, with the bells hanging down from him. The queen would be the mistress of evil, and of course the pawns and all the other characters that you'd take from were there to do the chess set, which I think would be a lot of fun. And I think that's letting the imagination run with it and develop merchandise from imagination that's taken from it. I do know that there is a good chance now of the Museum of the Weird being in a comic book, and which is supposedly coming out maybe after the first of the year. So again, like I said, as I began, it's taken on a life of its own, and God only knows where it'll take us. I really feel that I'd like to hand the concept of the Museum of the Weird to a creative person or a creative group that'll take it to the next step, or 4 or 5 steps or whatever, because I just feel that because it has a life of its own, I think it's time for other people to help it along on its merry way. And so I think it's going to have a long life if the right people handle it properly. And I think I'm excited about seeing that it is going to continue on.
To learn more about Rolly Crump, be sure to check out It's Kind of a Cute Story by Rolly Crump as told to Jeff Heimbach. Available now from Bamboo Forest Publishing, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other major booksellers. Also, if you enjoyed this volume and have not done so already, be sure to check out More Cute Stories Volume 1, Disneyland History, and More Cute Story Volume 2, Animators and Imagineers, to hear Rolly tell some more fantastic tales about the early days of Disneyland and the people he worked with.